Moving on to Thailand, the Southeast Asian country's political crisis does not seem to be easing. Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra had offered to meet with her opponents to try to solve the impasse. But they won't talk. They want Yingluck to resign and cancel next month's elections. Yingluck's cabinet said the elections would go ahead as scheduled on February 2nd.
I think the first thing that I think the people would like me to continue the work. So that's why I think this is that's why we are in the of the decision of the Pheu Thai party that need me to run re-election. But anyway, that I think election will be the final judged by the people of Thailand.
Meanwhile, thousands of protesters supported by the main opposition Democrat Party continue their efforts to shut down Bangkok, marching on main boulevards, blocking government buildings, and forcing civil servants to leave. The leader of the protesters said Yingluck would never survive to hold the election, saying she would be brought down by popular will.
The government has a new strategy. They insist on sticking with the election on February 2nd. I say go ahead. Whether they decide to move ahead or whatever, I'm convinced they won't be able to stay until February 2nd.
The protesters are calling for the creation of a People's Council to make political changes before another election. They accuse Yingluck Shinawatra of being the tool of her brother, Thaksin. The protesters believe he is the embodiment of corruption and evil and runs Thailand from exile in Dubai. No matter what the protesters say, Yingluck and Thaksin enjoy overwhelming support in Thailand's rural areas and among the poor. Polls show she'll easily win re-election. One economist says that's because both Shinawatra and her brother have increased spending in rural areas by as much as 50%. To tell us whether there is any peaceful way out of the standoff, we spoke to Mark Schneider, Senior Vice President of the International Crisis Group. It's an NGO specializing in analyzing sources of conflict to find ways to prevent them from turning violent. The Crisis Group has just issued a conflict alert for Thailand in its latest newsletter. I first asked him about his concern that there is a risk of violence across wide swaths of the country.
Well, clearly you've already seen some 8 people killed and perhaps 400 injured in the protests that have taken place in Bangkok. Today we heard that the opposition Democrat Party has threatened to close down all government offices and trying to disrupt the preparations for an election that's supposed to be held on February 2nd. And so obviously their intent is to prevent people from voting. And that could well provoke violence in other parts of the country as well as in Bangkok.
And Mark, in your estimate, who has the higher moral ground now? Yingluck has made concessions, but insists the February 2nd election will go ahead. Her opponents, including the Democrat Party, seem completely unwilling to negotiate.
There's a division between Bangkok and the rest of the country in many ways. Her party has, in fact, been returned to office in every election over the course of the past decade with a pretty strong majority. And so the decision now to go for an election, another election on February 2nd, to some degree also is her giving in to the demands that there be some additional way for the public to express its views on policies. As to the moral high ground, there's no question that the decision by her party to seek an amnesty, which was interpreted as a mechanism to benefit her brother as well as others, I think that probably that provided a hook for the opposition, which clearly intended to try and bring down her government to go to the streets. There's no moral high ground for anyone if they go against the Constitution and they go against democratic institutions.
But that amnesty bill you just mentioned was defeated in Parliament, and Yingluck said she was not going to introduce it again. So isn't that a dead issue?
One would hope so. But clearly the opposition is very unhappy about the reality that her party seems to be able, on a national level, to win a majority. And right now, what is necessary, in addition to going forward with the constitutional process, we argued in our conflict alert, is for there to be an effort by political leaders, civil society leaders, the religious leaders to come together and to try and pursue a dialogue, a national dialogue that would deal with the issues relating to state reform, the issues of decentralization, trying to find some common ground within a constitutional structure and within the reality that this has to be based on democratic voting.
One more question. Thailand is not the only Southeast Asian country that seems to have an opposition that is refusing to recognize recent elections. Neighboring Cambodia and Malaysia are also affected. Is there a common thread tying all these countries together?
I think that to some degree, these countries are all in the midst of democratic transitions at the same time that they're going through economic transitions. And they're attempting to bring in the majority of the population into both economic and political life of the countries. And it's not easy. And those who have interests and elites that have held power for a long time are obviously reluctant to see a democratic process that permits others to have a full share of decision making. But that's the only answer. If those countries want to continue on a path of economic progress, they have to continue on a path of democratic institution building.
That was Mark Schneider, Senior Vice President of the International Crisis Group. It's an international NGO dedicated to preventing violence. And as we heard, Cambodia is another country where the opposition party will not recognize that it lost last summer. It's charging the government of Prime Minister Hun Sen rigged the voting. Cheered by their supporters, leaders of the opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party were in court earlier this week. They were being questioned about anti-government protests. About 350,000 garment workers in the capital are striking for higher wages. Some mounted a demonstration on January 3rd. It turned violent. Military police started shooting. According to human rights groups, 4 people were killed. It was the worst political violence in Cambodia in more than 10 years. With more now on the political crisis in Cambodia and how it's playing out in social media, here's our contributor, Justine Drennan.
The workers' strike began last month in parallel with revived protests by Cambodia's main opposition group. The Cambodia National Rescue Party has been demonstrating off and on for months, demanding a probe into alleged cheating during the national elections in July. The party says it would have won the poll if not for vote tampering to prop up long-ruling Prime Minister Hun Sen. In December, the opposition protests drew their largest numbers yet, with a turnout of an estimated 50,000 people. But that all came to a halt with the shootings. Now, as protesters regroup, Cambodian social media users are weighing in on the likely causes and effects of the violence. This comment on the opposition's Facebook page says that by allowing security forces to shoot demonstrators, Hun Sen really shot himself in the foot. Please tell people not to despair. Now the whole world sees more clearly just how authoritarian Hun Sen's leadership is. Many Cambodians loathe Hun Sen not only because of his history of strong-arm tactics, but also because of his association with Cambodia's eastern neighbor, Vietnam. He came to power through a Vietnamese-backed government in the 80s, and the opposition often uses xenophobic rhetoric to condemn him as a Vietnamese agent. On the party's Facebook page, this opposition supporter asserts that Hun Sen's government is a Vietnamese puppet regime and that this is the last stand of Hun Sen. Negotiations are impossible. People across the country do not want to see clean leaders join hands with the killers and their illegal government. But not all netizens fault Hun Sen. One commenter on VOA Khmer's Facebook page says, "The attack does not amount to heinous acts. The measures were necessary." In fact, the Cambodian governments maintained that police were forced to shoot because rioters had joined the workers and posed a threat to stability. And another commenter on VOA's page asks, who is really sure whether the demonstrators were workers or someone else? Although the workers' strike was officially distinct from the opposition's protests, some social media users suggest that opposition leaders irresponsibly egged on the workers to gain more support for their movement. Referring to the opposition party's president and vice president, this Facebook user asks, "Did Mr. Samrainsy and Kem Sokha incite workers to strike until counter-demonstrators disabled them? Is this the fault of Samrainsy and Kem Sokha or not?" Another wonders, did these leaders who tried to incite the demonstrators think about how they might not be able to control the situation, and that it might eventually lead to the destruction of assets and to workers who refuse to participate being threatened? But most online commenters side with the opposition and against Hun Sen. One writes, "We must continue to struggle to eradicate the current authoritarian regime. We must continue to support the Cambodia National Rescue Party and not waver because of government propaganda." The shock of the violence briefly stopped the protests, but as most grievances of both the workers and the opposition party remain unaddressed, it's not surprising that demonstrations are starting to mount again. I'm Justine Drennan for LinkAsia.
Only about 5% of Cambodia's population use social media, but that does not count text messaging. Almost every Cambodian has a mobile phone, though messages are expensive.
Now on U.S. airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.